I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Ukraine crisis. Breaking news from Kiev now. Kiev is reporting that its forces detained a group of Russian paratroopers, claiming they crossed the border into eastern Ukraine. The U.S. ambassador to Kiev warned of, quote, Russian directive counteroffensive by pro-Moscow separatists. Ukrainian military spokesman Andriy Lysenko said the Ukrainian army detained 10 Russian paratroopers in the Donetsk region. That's the Donbass area where all the fighting and the depredations have been these last weeks and months. The spokesman for the Ukrainian military ministry, remember now, this is Ukraine speaking of the fighting going on in eastern Ukraine, said the Russians were detained with their documents and weapons and had provided statements. Stephen F. Cohen, a professor of Russian history at New York University and Princeton University Emeritus, joins now because while this news is right in front of us as the possible evidence of provocation leading to Russian military intervention, there is contradictory, paradoxical, at the same time, positive news from the diplomatic front within these same last hours at Minsk at a meeting of the Customs Union. Steve, a very good evening to you. I lead with the capture of the paratroops because, again, you will have noted that we've seen this pattern when there's a diplomatic breakthrough or diplomatic conversations that can lead to a settlement of Ukraine crisis, such as back in July. There was MH17. And when there's the possibility of a breakthrough, either through Berlin-Kiev conversation or Moscow-Minsk-Kiev conversation, there's suddenly a military action along the Russian border, despite the fact that there's no interest, I see it, for the Kremlin to provoke or interrupt these diplomatic conversations. What can we say about this pattern, Steve, knowing that we've got positive news diplomatically? Good evening to you.
Well, what makes it so hard to say anything definitively is we are in the classic fog of war and have been for weeks. There's a war in Ukraine, and you've got several parties, not only the rebels fighting in eastern Ukraine and the Kiev government, but you've got Washington and Moscow deeply involved, and NATO. And all parties are issuing information, and a lot of it is false information. Whether it's intentional or not, I don't know. But here we have another example. Ukraine says that they captured some Russian paratroopers. They put them on video, and a couple of the guys, the Russian guys, said things that seem not scripted to me, not right. Like, they told us that fascists control Ukraine, but now we're here. We see it's not that at all. I mean, how would they know? They haven't been to Kiev. It looks a little too scripted. But there's another issue here that's very important, John. Even those of us who believe that American policy is wrong-headed and has contributed to this crisis more than has Russian policy, nonetheless have to take a hard look at this charge that Russia, Putin, Moscow, has been sending weapons and advisors to the rebels in the Donbass in particular, and especially in recent weeks when it looked as though the Ukrainian forces might take those cities. Now remember, we talked about this last week. Putin did something different. He sent this convoy of humanitarian relief, these trucks, to Luhansk. And they got in, and they got out, and there was no military episode. And now Russia's announced they're going to send a second convoy, presumably to Donetsk. But I find plausible, even though I have no private information, the argument that Russia has been, particularly recently, sending heavier weapons and advisors to the rebels. And the reason is this. We talked about this at the beginning of our discussion. It's hard to imagine politically that Putin can tolerate, under any circumstances, the military defeat of the Donbass, because in the mind of Moscow, and not unreasonably, if the Donbass, these two capital cities of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, fall into the hands of Kiev, it means, in Moscow's mind, they have fallen into the hands of NATO. And the nightmare that NATO military bases would end up in Ukraine on Russia's borders very soon is intolerable. That's the reason Putin annexed Crimea back in March. That's the great fear. So it seems to me and this is an analysis. It's something more than educated speculation, but it is a very educated guess, that Putin desperately does not want to send direct military, does not want to undertake direct military action in Ukraine. I mean, in 18 hours, he could end this with his planes. He could clear out all this heavy artillery that Kiev is using to bombard these cities. He doesn't want to do that. So it seems the plan has been to give these rebels enough weapons to see if they can defend the cities themselves. Now we come back to the fog of war. Yesterday and this morning, remember it's 8 hours earlier in Moscow, there has come out of Moscow a whole slew of reports that the rebels have mounted a counteroffensive against the Ukrainian army and have trapped at least 3 divisions of the Ukrainian army between Donetsk and Luhansk, and killed quite a few of them and captured a lot of armored equipment. If that is true, then we see what's happening. That they got the new weapons, they got the advisors, and now Moscow's waiting to see what they can do with it. And apparently, if these reports are true, then they're doing well. And that takes us now, to wrap up this introductory statement, to Minsk, where Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, and Putin are meeting, met today, began a meeting. Poroshenko intended to come triumphant. He was on a roll. His military was, I wouldn't say blitzkrieging, but they were inching toward a storming of Donetsk and Luhansk. And he thought he would have the military upper hand when he sat down with Putin, whatever it is they want to talk about. But if these more recent reports are true, he comes in a desperate situation. His political base is crumbling in Kiev. They've called new elections to the parliament. Ukraine is crumbling as an economy. I mean, Kiev is destroying its own industrial infrastructure in the Donbass. Who's going to rebuild that? Its currency is bottoming out. The IMF has given it nowhere near enough money, and it comes with very harsh conditions. And now militarily, it appears that Poroshenko may not have this upper hand he thought he had 3 or 4 days ago when he was planning his trip to Minsk. So that's where we are today, I think, John.
We want to also mention a Russian convoy. There was a very successful first Russian convoy. There might be a second Russian convoy. So Russia's not doing just one thing, or fog of war. We can't just focus on the military advances or gunfire. We also have to look to the success of the imagery of Russia sending a humanitarian relief. Some of those trucks did get through. Some of those trucks did deliver and get out again. So it would look, Steve, at this point that Kiev has an incoherent response to all of these tools that Vladimir Putin has. It's a way of expressing the fact that it's up against a much larger, much more complicated force than it can fend off with just a few National Guard units and continual press releases from Kiev. It really looks like Poroshenko doesn't know which way to comment in order to fend off Moscow.
Well, you made the point in our discussion last Tuesday that the humanitarian convoy and all the drama around it was a kind of public relations coup for Putin.
Yes.
Because he shifted the conversation in the West from the military operations that allegedly Russia was waging covertly to the humanitarian disaster in eastern Ukraine. And let's remind ourselves that Putin's not fibbing about that. According to the United Nations, 2,000 civilians have been killed, and that was a figure they produced, the UN did, about 2 weeks ago. And nearly 1 million refugees, most of them fleeing across the border into Russia, which, by the way, is an enormous burden on Russia, but a sizable number of them fleeing to other parts of Ukraine. It's no longer safe to stay in those cities. The people left behind, you can see from the footage, are mainly elderly people. Women have tended to take their children and flee. The men have gone to fight or gone with the women, and these are now cities of pensioners who no longer get their pensions, who are infirm. This is a real tragedy. I mean, we raised a stink about this when it happened in Syria, when it's happened in other countries, but it's striking that the West did not back a humanitarian intervention of its own in eastern Ukraine. Europe could have done that. Washington could have done that. So when Putin did it, I think there was some sympathy for that. But now we have, in Kiev, new discussions following German Chancellor Merkel's visit to Kiev. I said Kiev, I meant Minsk, excuse me. Remember what Merkel said publicly. We don't know what she said privately, though we can guess, to the president of Ukraine, Poroshenko. She said two things of enormous importance, I think. The most important was there is no military solution. There is no military solution, which is saying to President Poroshenko, stop your military campaign. That's not the solution. Declare a ceasefire. And the other thing she said was the political solution for Ukraine is federalization. A Ukraine where the regions would not separate, would not go to Russia, but would stay in a unitary Ukrainian state, but a state in which they, the regions, would have the right, which they do not have now, to elect their own governors, have a large say in local cultural, linguistic, educational policy, in tax policy. This is very important because Obama and Kerry have abdicated leadership, and now Merkel has embraced it, but she's embraced it in a way that really endorses what Putin's been calling for.
Just a minute.
A ceasefire and federalization.
Just a minute, Professor. We'll come back and speak of the importance of the Chancellor's remarks after her visit to Kiev on Saturday last. Professor Stephen F. Cohen of New York University and Princeton University, I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. We begin our conversation about Ukraine crisis with Professor Stephen F. Cohen mentioning the claims by Kiev of war fighting, of the capture of Russian paratroops who are making confessions about how they've been misled by their masters in Moscow. And then we turn to the diplomacy that's going on at the same time. These are parallel events. And we're going to speak in a moment of what we know about the meeting of the customs union in Minsk. That's in Belarus, entertained by Lukashenko, the apparatchik leader of Belarus, a very favorable part of the Russian Federation for Vladimir Putin. But Professor Cohen, New York University, and he has a new piece up, an updated piece coming at The Nation within these next hours about his observations of this crisis entitled Patriotic Heresy Against the New Cold War. But the observations that are important now before we speak of Minsk are what we know about Chancellor Merkel's visit to Kiev to visit with Poroshenko, the president of Kiev, of Ukraine, on Saturday. Steve, Berlin has the banks, Berlin has the cash, Berlin can deliver the European Union. Poroshenko knows this. So does Washington. What is it that Poroshenko wants from the EU? What can Mrs. Merkel deliver that will persuade him to impose a ceasefire and start towards the process of settlement?
I don't think they have to persuade Poroshenko. They have to coerce him in this way. It's my analysis, but maybe I'm not entirely right, that Poroshenko's political situation in Kiev is not very good. He's the newly elected president, but everybody knows that about 40% or more of the country did not vote in that election. They didn't have any candidates, people who live in the southeast. Secondly, the parliament was a pre-Poroshenko parliament, and just recently Poroshenko denounced the parliament as a fifth column. Can you imagine? The parliament that brought him to power, that overthrew the previous president, that enabled him to have a presidential election. He's denounced it as a fifth column, and dissolved it. So there's going to be new parliamentary elections.
Yeah, that's just happened within the last hours. It was
I think the last 36 hours. Yeah.
Right. It struck me as a panicky political maneuver and high risk.
Well, here's what makes it more puzzling. What kind of national parliamentary elections can you have in October? I mean, a parliament, by any definition, whether it's called a Congress or a Soviet or a parliament, a federal assembly, is by definition representatives from the entire country coming to the Capitol and forming a legislative body. How are they going to have parliamentary elections in southeast Ukraine, where some 40 to 45% of the voters live? It's going to be another rump political institution.
Do you believe that Mrs. Merkel's visit or the friction after that visit led to Poroshenko dissolving the parliament? And
because he had done that before, but I think that would revealed is his desperation. And that leads you to conclude that his political base, that his primary political support is NATO, the European Union, and Washington. We have backed him, the West, unconditionally. But now Merkel's come forward with conditions. That's what I heard her say. One condition is you can't solve this problem by war.
Right.
So have a ceasefire and begin negotiations. And two, the kind of touchstone, the ramifying item on the negotiation is a new federal constitution in Ukraine. Now, it may be, I'm speculating here, and I don't like speculation, that Poroshenko is rushing to parliamentary elections to have them before this federalization debate occurs in Ukraine. Because the normal way to do it is you would draft a new constitution and have a referendum on it, maybe in conjunction with a new parliamentary election, because then deputies would take a position on the Constitution. But this rush for another election in a part of a country, not the whole country, raises questions about his political strength in Kiev. And therefore, I think that though the Western media has tended in the last 2 or 3 weeks to present Putin as being in a desperate situation because of the Ukrainian military's success, which now may not be so successful, it really is Poroshenko whose political, economic, and military situation may be bordering on desperate. And Merkel is really the political leader of Europe, and if we agree, I don't know if you agree, that Obama and Kerry have largely disappeared in connection with Ukraine.
Well, they're busy elsewhere with other problems.
They have Ferguson, they have Iraq,
yes.
They have Israel.
They're bombing in Iraq, and they're putting warplanes into Syria. So, of course, they're overtasked.
And so Putin must conclude, looking at that these guys talked tough 2 months ago, but they're distracted. There's nothing they can do. And last night on MSNBC, I think, a senator very, very close to the Obama administration, Murphy, a Democratic senator who sits on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, said flat out there will be no use of American military power in Ukraine.
Just a moment, Steve. We'll come back, and we've got to go to Minsk right away because that's where Vladimir Putin and Poroshenko have shaken hands. Steve Cohen of New York University, Princeton University. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Professor Stephen F. Cohen is here commenting on Ukraine crisis, and we're looking through the fog of war, but the fog of diplomacy as well. And Steve is momentarily commenting about how the Obama administration, having supported and we believe probably paid for a deal of Kiev's offensive and managed ability to sustain itself these many months since wintertime and the protests and the Maidan protests, we believe the Obama administration has stepped aside or deputized Berlin, Angela Merkel and Berlin, leading the EU to settle Ukraine crisis. And that's a positive because Europe wants a settlement. Steve, you were commenting how an American senator believes or has maintained on television that the U.S. will not involve itself militarily in Ukraine. That's a plus, but that doesn't rule out NATO, and it also doesn't remove, and I want to introduce this twist here, it also doesn't remove an enemy that Vladimir Putin has in Europe more than any other, I'm told, is Warsaw. Poland has a big stake in forcing Putin to back down over Ukraine. And do you measure that Putin has his eye on Warsaw and has his eye on Warsaw's command of Kiev?
If this Ukrainian crisis ends badly for Europe, and I continue to maintain it was Europe, backed by Washington, that precipitated this crisis last November. If this crisis ends badly, it is very bad for Poland, because the EU farmed out Ukrainian policy to Poland and Lithuania, if you can believe that. And what they wanted is what they still want. They want NATO troops based in the Baltics and in Poland. In fact, was it this morning, I think, in Europe, Rasmussen, the NATO political secretary, said that that would be on the agenda when NATO meets in Wales in September, and he called it a spearhead. We need to create a spearhead for NATO forces on Russia's borders in Poland and the Baltics. Nothing could be more provocative. I think that was an attempt to disrupt these talks in Minsk, if anything was. But at the moment, if this Ukrainian crisis ends well for Russia, and we could discuss what well means, it doesn't mean taking over Ukraine. It means keeping NATO out and a stable Ukraine. I think Poland is not going to get another license to conduct European policy. It didn't all come from Poland, but you're right. Warsaw's been driving this from the beginning.
Let's go to Minsk, because therein lies a solution possible, because the two principals, Poroshenko of Kiev and Vladimir Putin of Moscow, have deliberately shaken each other's hands on video for that to be played at home, Kiev and Moscow, across the Russian Federation. The man who is master of ceremonies is Lukashenko. This is the customs union. Poroshenko came to the customs union. That is a solution, Steve, and certainly Poroshenko knew it when he landed it. And by shaking hands with Vladimir Putin, hasn't he gone more than halfway towards saying that he's ready to make a deal? Just make me an offer.
Well, he has a way out. Formally, let me emphasize this, formally doesn't mean much in politics, but it's a useful device. Formally, these are not talks about the war. They're talks about something that's on the agenda. Poroshenko signed this trade agreement with Europe about a month ago. Russia has always maintained that if Ukraine becomes a trading partner with all the privileges of the European Union, much of its trade, and I think it's about 25% of Ukrainian exports, and that's not even mentioning the 3 million Ukrainians who work in Russia and send their wages home to support their families. But much of Ukraine's trade with Russia will be curtailed, and Putin mentioned this morning in his opening statement in Minsk, because Ukraine will become a corridor for European goods to flood the Russian market duty-free, because that's the relationship that Russia has with Ukraine. So what he's saying is, and the Russians have said this for 2 or 3 years, ever since this issue arose of Ukraine becoming a trading partner of the European Union, is that you will no longer have, go ahead and sign it if you want, but you will no longer have favored status in our market. That would be devastating, because the kinds of things that Ukraine produces are not wanted in Europe. I mean, name something that Ukraine produces that would be competitive on the European market. Ukraine's natural market is and has been for decades Russia. And why anyone would want to lose that favorable economic relationship, if you want your country to be prosperous, is beyond me. But that's formally what they're there to discuss. What now is Ukraine's position vis-a-vis the Russian market now that Ukraine has signed this relationship with the economic union? Now, that's the formal discussion, and it's enormously important, but existentially important, as you say, John, is the discussion of the war, because the two are are linked.
Vladimir Putin has an ambition, too, in these discussions, and he's going to press the point. He wants to talk to representatives from the Donbass, not just Poroshenko. He wants those voices to be involved in this negotiation.
Well, he wants Poroshenko. I mean, what Putin is calling for is very clear. He wants an immediate ceasefire, a pullback of the Ukrainian army from the Donbass, and negotiations under the auspices of the European Union, the United States, and Russia, fair enough, among all the parties involved in the conflict inside Ukraine. And that means the political representatives of eastern Ukraine. And Poroshenko has said he will never talk with that's the so-called Donbass People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. You remember they had referenda several months ago. But Putin has said those are the legitimate political representatives of eastern Ukraine, not some bureaucrat you're going to appoint to represent them, and talks must be with them. And now Merkel has come along on Saturday and really leaned hard on Poroshenko about the need for a federalized Ukraine. So she sort of reinforced Putin's negotiating position. I don't see any other way out if it's going to be diplomatic. And remember, John, back in April, all the parties, the great powers and small powers involved, the United States, Europe, Russia, signed in Geneva, and the Ukrainian foreign minister was there. He signed it, an appeal for just such negotiations. And how many people have died and been displaced since April because there has been no ceasefire? So what needs to be done is clear. Whether Poroshenko's in a position or a frame of mind to give it, we'll probably know in a couple days.
Let's play the weather card then. This is a news release from Minsk. Russian President Vladimir Putin said he and his Ukrainian counterpart, Petro Poroshenko, agreed to renew a dialogue on energy flows to Ukraine during a meeting in Minsk. ITAR TASS reported. Putin described the talks as positive, adding that he is committed to seeking peace in eastern Ukraine. That's the energy card, Steve. It's late August. Winter can start as early as late September, early October. Germany doesn't want to pay the premium price, and Ukraine knows that it already owes a king's fortune to Moscow for the energy that it's already used. It needs supplies for the wintertime. Putin is ready to deal for energy costs. He can discount and he can forgive debts.
I don't know if you or your listeners remember a British film years ago called The Mouth That Roared with Peter Sellers.
Brilliant.
But an impoverished country decided to invade the United States because when defeated, an impoverished country always gets a lot of aid from the United States. It was a comedy. There's a bit of Mouse That Roared in Ukraine. Remember last week the Prime Minister announced that he was going to sanction the transit of Russian natural gas to Europe across Ukraine. Now that was dropped. Merkel undoubtedly put her foot down on that. But we haven't talked about the energy card. Ukraine owes Russia $5 billion. $5 billion. For energy it has already received and consumed. So Russia has put Ukraine on a pay-in-advance basis and said it's shipping nothing till it gets its $5 billion. Ukraine says we don't have $5 billion. And Russia says, yes, you do. The IMF is giving you $17 billion. We'll just take a chunk of that. And about a month ago, it looked like a down payment of $3 billion would be forthcoming, and this problem would be solved temporarily. But that fell apart, and so that now has to be discussed, and Putin says we're willing to discuss it.
The IMF, the World Bank, the United States, certainly the European Union, does not have $5 billion. They've never had it. So the dream scenario has to include a settlement of that debt, presumably if it goes Warsaw's way or Washington's way. I've waited for months for that formula to be addressed, Steve. No one's talking about that. In fact, the only one talking about energy is Vladimir Putin.
Why do you say that the IMF, Washington, and Europe don't have $5 billion to pay Ukraine's debt?
Because I've been told they're all out of money. They turn their pockets out when it comes up. They've got debts. In addition, they have other problems, which is countries that are far more needier and can make claims if they start distributing money to Moscow, claiming that they're paying Kiev's debts for the previous regime.
Well, they would pay it to Kiev to pay Moscow, but I take your point. But do you mean to say that the financial promises made by Washington and the IMF and Europe to Kiev are fraudulent?
I'm only giving you what I've been told. They don't have the money. Maybe in future, maybe they'll sell bonds, but they don't have the money now, is what I've been told. Don't have it.
If you know that or suspect it, or you've been told that, the president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, may have heard that too.
Yeah, I think so.
So he would know, as he stands in Minsk tonight, that he, talking to Putin, that he's in a more desperate position than even I suggested I think he is.
Well, that explains a deal, Steve, of something you flagged a week ago. Why the serving prime minister of Kiev was all of a sudden threatening to cut off transit to natural gas to Europe. He's not in a very good position either. And with winter coming on, Europe suddenly paid attention. But what I'm looking at is a lot of empty bank accounts. And in fact, you can sort of ask where they're getting all the firepower that they're using against Luhansk. Who's giving them the weapons? They don't have it. When we come back, I'm talking to Professor Steve Cohen. We're enjoying this because it's always follow the money. It comes down to follow the money. You notice how we're not spending a lot of time with ideology. Professor Stephen F. Cohen of New York University and Princeton University. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. I understand that I'm speaking with Professor Stephen Cohen about Ukraine crisis, and I should be very grave, but I'm not feeling grave because money came up. And I'm providing what I knew over these last weeks was that Ukraine doesn't have the money, and its so-called sponsors, that would be the United States and perhaps the European Union, perhaps NATO, perhaps IMF, perhaps World Bank, they don't have the money either. There are a lot of other demands on those same organizations in Europe. You will remember that Europe is bouncing along a recession this last year. In fact, there's reason to believe some of the countries are struggling, including Germany. So, Steve, we'll come back to this. The money. It always comes down to the money. Ukraine doesn't have the money to pay for the gasoline or the diesel fuel that's flowing into the armored personnel carriers and tanks and that it's using to shell parts of its country, reducing the asset base of the country even more. They're getting deeper and deeper into the hole. That oil is coming. That fuel is coming. I think even sort of the bullets themselves are coming from either NATO, the United States, or somebody's promises, not from Kiev.
All right. You're deep throat, and you just told me to follow the money. That takes us to an enormously important point. What's going on in Ukraine? What began as a civil war has become a proxy war between Russia and the West. Now, the enemies of Russia, or intelligence agencies, say Russia is supplying weapons to the rebels.
Right.
Let's say they are. We don't know, but as I said at the beginning of the broadcast, it seems reasonable to me that that's part of Putin's strategy.
Right, and they're reporting tonight that a Russian heavy helicopter fired on a Ukraine border post, and that they've captured Russian paratroopers who wandered into Ukraine. It's consistent with weapons going across the border.
It is, and the reason is Putin does not want to send Russian forces or air power and get involved in this war, and this is a different way of doing it. But why would you call that a proxy war? Well, you just made the point. Kiev is completely bankrupt. Now, it doesn't need weapons. Ukraine is a weapons dump. I mean, much of Soviet weaponry and post-Soviet weaponry was built jointly by Russia and Ukraine in Ukraine. Ukraine had plenty of those Buks that allegedly shot down the Malaysian airliner. Russia has scores, hundreds, maybe thousands of tanks and heavy artillery. What he doesn't have is money to pay his soldiers, to buy spare parts, to get the factories going, the weapons factories, or to pay for energy, as you said. It's getting that money from the West. I mean, Washington has admitted that it's financing Ukraine. One other thing, the Deputy Secretary or Assistant Secretary of the Department of Defense testified to the Senate about a month ago that his department, the American Department of Defense, is, and I quote, embedded, that was the word he used, in the Ukrainian Department of Defense, the Defense Ministry. Therefore, American advisors are probably advising, if not guiding, Ukraine's war effort, and it's being financed. That's a proxy war. Putin sends weapons and advisors. The United States sends money and advisors. What's the difference? The difference is this could become an international war.
I want to mention one other contract that I've sent to you, Steve. This is from the Department of Homeland Security. It was an order to purchase border fence, $435,000, a contract awarded to BK Engineering System from Kiev, and it was paid for by the United States government. Security fencing. That's how far down they've reached into the American taxpayer in order to sustain border fencing. That's not going to hurt anybody, but Ukraine doesn't have an ability to patrol its own border or to stop foxes from going back and forth to Russia.
I thought that border fencing was earmarked for the American-Mexican border.
No, Steve, it's going to Ukraine. BK Engineering System from Kiev is not giving us a cut rate to build border fencing in Mexico. This award notice came from the Department of State. Yes,
I understand. I do. Which takes us back to whatever's going. By the way, for listeners who don't have a good fix on Minsk, it's the capital of Belarus, which was a Soviet republic until the Soviet Union ended, is now an independent state. Belarus, in all regards, is even closer to Russia than Ukraine, than eastern Ukraine. In fact, Belarus is called little brother of Russia. It's extremely close. There is supposed to be, it's been negotiated, but it hasn't been enacted, a union state, an actual state between Belarus and Russia. Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has been called the last dictator in Europe, but it now turns out that he may be the peacemaker in Europe, since this is the second venue for negotiations that he has hosted. Once before at a lower level. But remember, Lukashenko, Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has brought to his capital, Minsk, the president of Russia and the president of Ukraine. It is also, just to finish this anecdotal locating of Minsk, it was just outside Minsk in 1991 that the Soviet Union was abolished in a hunting lodge near the Polish border by Yeltsin and the head of Ukraine and the head of Belarus. So it's a fateful place, shall we say.
Steve, we've got about a minute, and we've got a week to penetrate this fog of diplomacy. What should we look for? About a minute, Steve.
I would look at two things. We began with these because they're connected. What's going to come out of this meeting between Putin and Poroshenko? Is it going to lead now to another and more impactful meeting? In other words, is diplomacy getting traction? That's the question. But parallel, how this war is going in the Donbass. Ukraine says, Kiev says, it's about to storm the cities and win the war. Moscow is reporting that the rebels have launched a major counteroffensive. Is this their Tet offensive? Is the Ukrainian army going to crumble? If it does, then American policy crumbles with it, because the United States, let me end on this, unlike Merkel, has been against a ceasefire and against federalization. There's where we stand now.
Professor Stephen F. Cohen of New York University, Princeton University, Russian History Emeritus, the author of Patriotic Heresy Against the New Cold War, an article at The Nation. It'll go up on the website. It'll be in the magazine within these next hours. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.